One of the key issues confronting the United States right now is whether, how, and how much to allow for competition in the energy space, especially in the parts of the energy industry that have historically been heavily regulated, especially by public utility commissions. The panel now is composed of a really amazing group of people that are going to share their perspectives on the role of competition in advancing the clean energy economy. Well, three very interesting perspectives, obviously coming from very different places. I'm curious how all of you think about, one issue that perhaps is particularly salient in California, certainly for folks that work in California government, is keeping the lights on. And in contrast to cellular telephony and cellular communications where, calls get dropped. It happens on Sand Hill Road all the time. Electricity is not a space where we have tolerated, historically, problems with reliability. And that's a big part of the reason for the heavy investment in the kind of centralized infrastructure that we have now. How do you think about incorporating the changing value of reliability and balancing that against the need to innovate and the need to create greater customer choice in the new energy future? How should the president think about that?
I don't know that those are opposing objectives. I think that they require a much different mindset. And so we're quickly reaching the point where people are going to have a community solar array in one circuit. They're going to have electric vehicle chargers or electric bus rapid transit on another circuit. And you need to get the power up the grid and over to the other side. And so part of what we need then is a much more nimble grid. That's infrastructure. I hate to say it, we're going to have to replace a lot of old wooden poles that carry that. We actually need to have smart transformers that can tell you when something's happening at the end of a thin feeder circuit and communicate to another thin feeder circuit on the other side, say, I have excess electricity, I need some excess electricity, and then maybe report it up the line to some central store that's the backup, the central bank for electricity. That's essentially what the ISOs do, the independent systems operators, the balancing authorities. The pieces are there, we just have to make it more nimble. What I see as the big obstacle, because I'm talking to New York State about this all the time, is that someplace in there we need that router that actually can read all those things and operate it. What is the system architecture that this system has? Once we figure that out, not only will these issues be resolved for a while, but we will actually be able to make the whole system more plug and play and more amenable to more customer choice. It'll bring down the cost of using these technologies. It'll do everything that the same kind of systems have for the internet and for telephony. But we have to really apply ourselves to that and make those right investments. My problem as a regulator is that we don't understand that well enough to really make a wholesale investment here in California. So we've sort of been playing it, let's walk, let's jog, let's run. Let's try to keep up or ahead of technology without getting in the way.
Well, so I work on moonshots. That's, and sometimes you hit and sometimes you don't, but those are long-range, big breakthrough technical problems and challenges to big intractable things. So a moonshot is not even, some people could argue, SpaceX landing a rocket yesterday. That's not a moonshot. That was a technical problem solved within the physical. That's great. None of what you're asking about is even remotely in the zip code of moonshot or SpaceX, right? I mean, this is technically viable. We have the tools, the technology, the know-how, and do we have them in the right place? Do all the right people understand them to organize rule sets around them? No. Are we investing huge amounts of money in government relations, advocacy, and lobbying to peddle fear on this question? Yes. This is the Joe the Camel argument, to go to your to your thing, that we can't get there with this much disaggregation and distribution because sooner or later the lights will go off for all of us. And maybe we'll have a few dislocations where people will say, those are proof points. They went off, and the clock can be right twice a day. I know Arun's work at Google and here at Stanford, seeks to optimize this. There's too many people working on this, the technology and engineering and technical problem solving around this. So I don't want to say it's a red herring in the sense that it is a very real problem to manage, solve, and implement, but you inevitably are forced to. It's not like we're going to have a choice. We're not going to get there first on storage and then go, but let's wait to figure out how to integrate the storage. It's not like we're going to proliferate more on control in the digital home and say, let's really wait until a utility can guarantee it. I can remember when I lived in Hong Kong in the 90s, and Hong Kong is free market, things come in from everywhere, and there was actually a video fax machine with that it was slow, but bits and bytes of video, and I thought, this is so cool. I'm going to take one of these fax machines home with me to the U.S. And you remember there's the sticker on the bottom by the FCC going, if you plug this into any RJ11 jack, it will be Armageddon. The world will blow up if something that we have not approved creates non-reliability through your RJ11 jack in your home. So you want innovation, not go to the website, read our brochure and buy a Princess phone, but don't even remotely think about an RJ11 jack plug-in on your own, right? And that's where the utilities are with some of this now. We have the tools, the techniques, the science, the engineering, and everything else to problem solve. We're not sufficiently organized or informed with the integrity necessary to create the rule sets to maximize that technical engineering and integrate it into our systems at a rate that the devices are coming online.
I'll just, it was earlier mentioned that about 25% of the people on the planet do not have electricity. It is inconceivable that the way that they will get affordable electricity is by rebuilding the electricity distribution architecture of France or Pennsylvania. That's not going to happen. They are going to have a distributed architecture, and it can be and will be designed appropriately, and it does need money, and they do need to stop burning carbon products and move directly to this new architecture.
So, Reed pointed strongly, I think, to the idea that there needs to be an enhanced role for the federal government, for the president, in looking at antitrust questions, right? Questions around competition and fair competition on the customer side of the energy picture, perhaps also on the wholesale side. The question I would have is, what is the right, traditionally the customer side of electricity has been a preserve of state authority. The Federal Power Act says that the federal government has jurisdiction over wholesale interstate energy and not retail. So what is the appropriate role for the new president in changing that relationship, trying to create a national market for some of the technologies that Andy would like to see brought to market? What is the appropriate role, what is the appropriate continuing role for the state public utility commissions, which have traditionally managed that retail relationship?
I don't have a good answer to that just yet. It's why I talk a lot to my colleagues in the state of New York, because we think that if you want these technologies to reach scale quickly and for the price to drop and for people to invest not only in the technology themselves, but in increasing manufacturing of rooftop solar, of residential battery storage, of smart inverters that can deal with a lot of other issues that come up in the electric grid, smart meters, aggregate demand response products out of hundreds of individual consumers that can then bid into markets and actually compete with central station generation. We have to have some consistency. And we're not getting a lot of leadership from FERC. I think what we're getting is appropriate right now. They're letting us be the laboratories, and they're stepping back sometimes. Periodically, they get in the way. But that's our challenge as well, is that as these new technologies come into the marketplace, how do we enable them and not stifle them, but keep the system operating and fair?
Well, you know, FERC's had its fingers burned. You know, they've taken a run at this, you know, in the 90s, and had to withdraw from that, from some of the perverse and adverse effects that came from the push towards a national competitive market in electricity, right? I mean, this is in Wonkyville, but there's a lot of wonks in the room. So you know, if we're taking it into a simple form, you know, we'd have to sort of just step back as a people for a moment and say, how can it be? How can it be that we have fungibility and liquidity for BTUs of liquid energy across the nation, but we have a completely different rule set that is balkanized, that is illiquid for electrons across the nation? How could we have two separate sets for the manifestation of the same thing, the delivery of energy to our people in an optimized form with the greatest efficiencies in a free enterprise economy? I mean, that's just dumb. It's like, choose one or the other. Are we, you know, this is Britain. Are we driving on the left side of the road, but only with the buses, you know, and the motorcycles come next week? I mean, it's just dumb, right? So we have to address the question with some seriousness. And if we've been burnt before in the 90s because it wasn't right, or my friend Pat Wood and, you know, sought to do this in more regionalized basis with the RTOs, et cetera, well, then let's take another look at it and say, how do we take it from laboratories, but actually say, well, let's just fortify and crown the PUCs and say we understand why these are all the domain and jurisdiction of the states. But we need to update and modernize it commensurate with the attributes and outcomes and goals of the more logical national policy in a globally connected and not dislocated market that we live in. If we live in a connected world, we certainly live in a connected country now, that means the 100-year-old model of state by state by state needs to be rethought through. And that may happen on the back of a lawsuit. I don't think it'll be against ExxonMobil. I think it may be challenging the Interstate Commerce Clause and the idea that I can't send electrons from Nevada into California based on a solar guy across the border. You know, if my house is 2 houses down at Lake Tahoe, you know, I can't send it across the border because the two different states disagree on the fungibility of that clean, cost-effective electron. And it should be a huge differentiation in price because the Nevada utility needs to protect itself and has more friendly regulators about how to calcify its monopolistic powers. That whole model has to come down, right? And so it will be changed. And if it's not changed by legislation or regulation, Reed's right. It'll happen with litigation. But I think there is some inevitability that we will get to greater fungibility, efficiency, and liquidity of electrons that match what we've been doing with BTUs for years.
So 3 things. First of all, everyone here should read Michael's article when it comes out in the NYU Law Review, because he knows more about the answer to this question, as you will see when you see that article, certainly than I do. The second thing I'd like to say is there are a number of states already in the United States that are more zealously pro-competition along the lines that I described on that chart than the federal government has ever been. And it is the same with respect to every sectoral reform that you see in the United States. So the telecom reforms were actually led by the state of California, state of New York and the state of Illinois. So that's why the laboratories of democracy actually work pretty well. And then lastly, you're asking a question about our federalism. It was the exact same question presented in the telecom era. The same regulatory commissions do the electricity and do telecom, and the telecom-y side of them were very, very anxious about the intrusion of the federal government in the 1990s along the lines of the story that I just mentioned. And they sued me in a lawsuit that I used to call States versus Reed. But its official name was AT&T versus Iowa Utilities Board, and it went to the Supreme Court in 1990, and Justice Scalia wrote the majority opinion vindicating the idea that the federal government could establish a national methodology for the sector. It couldn't set the exact price state by state, but it could establish a national methodology, which is exactly what you're talking about. And that's exactly what we now know from that Supreme Court case is in fact permissible?
This is not going to be an even transition. We're in the midst of things that are bubbling up from below and destabilizing fairly old structures. And I don't think that anybody has a perfect vision on how you make it national. And so I'll just point to the fact that one of the things that we wrestled with as we got large amounts of variable renewable energy, the wind blows at different times of the day than when people are using electricity. Solar tends to drop off as the sun gets closer to the horizon. So we have a variable electric system now. What we started to do is look in California, what can we do with other states? How do we begin to do that? And we set up what's sort of a meetup for electrons. We called it the energy imbalance market for some arcane reason. That's what everybody wanted it to be. I think it was an economist and a lawyer who got together and picked the name. But what essentially we're doing is we're buying excess renewables for other states across the West, because their wind blows at a different time of the day. And there's a 2-hour difference between when the sun comes up in New Mexico and when it comes up here, and vice versa. And so we start to do these trades. And it's been fairly informal. The FERC agreed to look the other way and let us do this. Very comforting to know that they were paying attention, but not deciding that they had to act on it. And it's been fairly successful. What we're starting to see now is the utilities who have participated in this very, very limited market are starting to say, well, what else could we do if we actually had West-wide markets and we're trading? Now the challenge is the utility regulators kind of say, you know, that energy imbalance market thing, it worked. It wasn't really an oddball court, and we just had to look the other way when it happened. And now here's this other opportunity to do a larger kind of a market in the West. How do we actually allow that, protect people against market abuses, make sure that we protect the environmental goals that we have here in California and Washington and Oregon, but at the same time take advantage of this larger potential market? These are big challenges in the West. They've settled them in the East Coast from the top down. Here, given the fact that we all breathe the free and clean air of the West, as opposed to being tied to decadent British imperialism like they are on the East Coast, we're going to have to find this for ourselves. And it's not going to look like the solutions that people have elsewhere in the country, partly because of our energy needs and the way we can generate that without carbon. So I think that there is a need to have national markets, particularly where you're trying to get to scale with new technologies. But at the same time, this is a big country. It's a damn big country.
Notwithstanding, I'm from Texas. I love the pride thing, so I'm all about that. East Coast, West Coast, Texas. I think that there's some things that cut across all those things, right? I mean, a Nest thermostat's available everywhere, whether you're a competitive thermostat, whether you're a competitive market, a regulated market, a monopoly, whatever. The devices are available everywhere, and the paradigm of the people that you are regulating to purvey them, interact on them, manage the thing, have the same dilemma everywhere. So even if you have different laboratories and differentiated cultures and different structures and politics and everything yielding all these different solutions, that's not to say we shouldn't be on a learning curve to distill best of as fast as possible, because the curves of the penetration and what's happening as fast as possible. It's not what Andy wants on a technology push basis. It's what society is evolving on a demand pull basis. This is occurring inevitably whether we want it or not, and it is occurring faster than policymakers and regulators have the agility to perform in any useful way for society good on the macro or micro problem. So fora like this are meant to be bringing convergence to that dialogue. And so we need some intelligent core plans distilled from all those sort of regional lessons. And what I would tell you is, first amongst them is we're going to have to move from regulators that are in symbiotic relationships with the legacy purveyors, the utilities, and saying, how do we sort of protect your interest to have the last throes of the 20th century's best social compact? And they're going to have to jump ahead and say, what is the 21st century social compact with the inevitability of these new devices? And right now they're kind of caught in a schizophrenic conundrum around these things. And you got to get through that conundrum and break through that and decisively say, we're going to live in the future. And when you do, you're going to get to this liquidity, you're going to get to this competition, and you're going to get to the technical change. One more thing. Before I became a regulator trying to promulgate markets and LED lights and everything else, my whole career as an independent power developer was as a result of the regulation of PURPA and the PURPA reforms, right? Public Utility Reform? Regulatory Policy Act? Yeah. And which created the independent power industry, right? So you got in the independent power industry when I did in the mid to late 80s, old guy now. And you would you'd go talk to the utilities who were saying the same thing. Boy, there's a sticker on the bottom of that power plant. You blow up the whole system just by being a privately owned power plant. And say, we can't do this. It'll make us unreliable. It'll make us non-affordable. We need to protect the system. Let's lock down. It's the exact same behaviors that is innate in any monopoly, protecting its own interest, right? And so once we calmed them down, and then and the court cases were settled, and we agreed to let them all create private sector subsidiaries to join us in joint ventures so they could profit it as we slayed their inefficiencies. Once we came to the new paradigm that allowed the independent power industry to emerge, we found out, gosh, the thing that really bothered them most was that their whole life, their whole industry for electricity delivery was all about load forecasting. And load forecasting back then was month ahead. Load forecasting. When is the major maintenance on the coal plant that operates at 61%? Next month. Good, see you at the country club. And that was load forecast. So then these IPPs came on, and they're all these privately owned entities all of a sudden in this monopolistic behavior, and they're going, we got to do week ahead forecasting? Are you serious? Week ahead? We've got a plan with the things. And now what they're actually having to do is day by day, minute by minute, meteorologically induced forecasting because of cloud cover with the solar. And when does the storage come on to hedge the pricing and everything else? So everybody's got to think. Oh my God, this is like a world away from 25 years ago in the independent power industry with like a month ahead. It's like we got to think, we got to work with Arun and find out how to engineer ourselves so we can incorporate a battery with a solar panel with a nest thermostat. This is killing us. They're going to kill us, right? Okay, then let them go. Right? Either they're going to become participants in what is inevitable, what society demands, what we must have for grand micro and macro challenges, or they're going to go the way of Eastman Kodak. But having the schizophrenic conundrum to say, can we just do it so it's only day by day or minute by minute? They're going to have to be commensurate with the technology because it's not optional. We're not trying to induce this ramp in the diffusion of innovation. It is occurring anyway.
So let me ask a follow-up question, maybe for Reed and Michael, that relates to what Andy just said. A number of the utilities are interested in participating in this, right? So in California, we have a split. PG&E wants to rate base their electric vehicle charging. Other utilities want to take a different approach. In Georgia, Georgia Power wants to participate, maybe control, the distributed solar market. Other utilities are exploring the idea of having an unregulated subsidiary along the lines of what Andy was saying, participate in this distributed energy revolution. So Reed pointed to the example of the baby bells, the wireline utilities that transformed themselves into the Verizon and AT&T of today. They went through that Kodak moment and saw it as an opportunity and were able to transform themselves. What's the right approach to these, whether they're dinosaurs, whether they are companies that are facing a transformative moment and an opportunity? What's the right approach to facilitating their participation or allowing their participation without creating a situation where they can abuse their monopoly power, their incumbent monopoly power, to forestall competition with the Nest thermostats of the world?
Well, I think we have a very imperfect description of what we want the end state to be. We don't really talk about what we want. We talk about other metrics. How many renewable energy power plants have you got in your system? How much of your electricity comes from renewables? We aren't talking about reducing carbon. What we want from our energy system, whether it's electric or gas for heating, cooking and cooling, or it's for transportation, is greenhouse gas emissions down, reliability up, and cost effectiveness. And cost effectiveness probably means something different in the future because it's going to actually focus somewhat on value. My telephone is much more expensive than my landline was, but it does a lot more things for me. And so I think that we're going to start to find that the energy system can actually supply more of those opportunities for people as well. As I said, we're starting to see a convergence between the electric industry and telecommunications. So I think we have to really describe what we want the end state to be like so people are all shooting at the same thing. We have to have better ways to measure it than just focusing on individual technologies. Then I think we have to really examine what are the barriers to achieving that and smooth them. I'll just say that we can be a regulatory friction. It's pretty clear to me that if it takes us 4 years to actually do a standard for interconnection of distributed energy resource technologies, and now we have to go back and redo portions of it for energy storage as a new kind of distributed energy resource, that's not a very effective way because in 3 years, that battery storage market has actually begun to mature and accelerate even before we can describe how it's going to fit in the system. So we have to all kind of get some general sense of what we want that end state to be. Second, I think that there is a role for that kind of central financing for infrastructure that the utilities do. Nobody wants to own their own goddamn wooden pole in their backyard. That's not a very competitive marketplace. It's kind of a pain in the ass. You know, people want to put their posters on it. Nobody wants to maintain it. You have squabbles between all the people using that same piece of infrastructure. So there's going to remain that piece of it that probably is a natural monopoly. We need to have better ways to deal with that. And then I think we're going to have to figure out how do people actually begin to do these. We're about to enter into a big experiment here. We've had 2 in Southern California Edison's territory. Once when San Onofre disappeared from the grid, that created a big hole because the system was designed around that. You can't deal with it immediately. You got to do something. One of the things that we said to them is, okay, go fill it. Give us 50% of that from no carbon resources, not just renewable energy, but no carbon resources. So they made the biggest commercial purchase of battery infrastructure in the U.S. Big boost to the battery industry. 200 megawatts scattered at 4 substations, as well as a lot of stuff behind the meter that customers chose and brought forward and the utility helped to finance. So I think that it's there. I think that we actually need to sometimes get out of the way to allow them to do that or give them the right kinds of signals. Yes, you will get reimbursed for your cost of purchasing that infrastructure plus a fair return on your investment dollars so that your investors are willing to keep loaning you cheap money so that capital costs don't become a big part of this transition. They're also going to bring forward about $500 million of improvements to the distribution system that's going to support all these distributed energy resources that will allow more customer choice and customer value. And we're probably going to make them start to compete against some private providers of some of those tools. Do we need to upgrade a substation, or can it be met by 5,000 rooftop solar arrays with smart inverters actually creating some of the ancillary services that you'd otherwise meet with expanded a substation and bidding that into a market? So we're about to start to investigate these things. Nobody has a clear idea how it's going to work, but we'll walk, jog, run.
So monopoly is not an evil word. You can earn a monopoly. That's called winning in competition. Businesses that earn monopolies in competition will find that sooner or later someone will bypass them and they will find that it's eroded. Or you can have, as is the case here, a natural monopoly, meaning it's not possible to imagine economically that someone else would put up all those poles and attach those same lines to all of those houses to have universal service. So that is a monopoly that is there to stay. But the policy decision is, what are the limits that the law is going to define around the extent of that monopoly? So you would ask the question this way: why would we ever want the distribution utility to be in the business of installing energy efficiency or distributed solar behind the meter? What would be the positive reason for that? I'll make the case in a nutshell. They're really big, and they'll do whatever they're told by the regulators, and this is really important, so we have to hurry.
They have cheap capital, and they get to scale quick.
And the reason they have cheap capital is because they don't have any risks, because they
protected.
don't have any competition in the natural monopoly. And
Bingo.
the regulator guarantees a return. That's the strongest possible argument. I personally think it's a losing argument. I think that way you never find out what innovation really can get for you, and you never find out what competition is about to invent, and you foreclose the risk of the future turning out to produce rewards that are unimaginable.
I'll just counterpose the success of the renewable portfolio standards across the country against that.
I don't understand that.
Okay, renewable portfolio standards require the incumbent electric utilities, most of whom are monopolies, some of them are public utilities, to meet customer need through this range of technologies we deem to be renewable. You have
That's
to,
okay.
and so they did that. They did that really well. They brought down the price.
But you're just telling them to buy in a competitive market different sources. That's fine.
Oh, okay, but all I'm saying is that it was that use of their cheap capital and their ability to get to scale quickly that actually made this happen.
But cheap capital's not scarce. I mean, it's not scarce. If I look around in the world of industry and balance sheets and availability and cost of capital, I would actually consider most of the purveyors in the utility industry, who I know are the ones that you have to deal with, but they are the weak zebras. Okay, they are the easiest ones to pick off and say, let's gobble them up in a massive consolidation if they don't have too many liabilities. So yes, they have cheap capital because they are monopolistically protected jurisdictions that are functionally outsourced taxation authorities regulated by the government. That's who they are. Yeah. So yes, that'll make you cheap capital, right? But that's not cheaper than Google or Applied Materials or Intel's capital, right? And the new participants are out there. So I'm not worried about...
You guys came in late on Ivanpah. You guys came in late on a variety of other projects. Somebody else had to step up first, and that was the utilities who issued that PPA, got construction underway. So I applaud your entrance into that market, you weren't first. But you were a follower. You were a follower.
And not only that, a follower into distributing electricity at all, right? And by the way, there will be other followers in numerous form coming in new ways. That's right. I salute the utility industry as much as I salute Alexander Graham Bell and Edison, right? There is a role for these first actors to enable these earlier forms of the social compact. What we're talking about now is evolving the social compact, which is not a choice. We are splitting this country now amongst those that are educated and affluent and can put a solar rooftop, and avoid being part of the commons, which was part of the old social compact, leaving the heaviest cost and the dirtiest energy and everything to everybody else.
Yeah, but I live in the Central Valley. That's the place that didn't get electricity first.
And I'm not questioning you on this.
It was San Francisco and LA that got it because those were fat markets.
So I'm not questioning you on this. But wait a second. I mean, what you have said, I totally agree with. Your previous statement, within your role, and I know you are heroic, and California is a leader in these things. Don't mistake what I'm saying. But what you outlined in your previous comments is we are missing a strategy. Yes. That's basically what you said.
Yes.
You basically said the succession of steps to the outcome we need and the cadence and time frame to get there isn't there. And you're having to react with the tool set you've got, with the partners you're dancing with. Right? And so this is the core takeaway that this panel needs. And Reed put up an example of what it should be or can be in a roadmap. What's the strategy? Right. Your question then was, what do you do with the legacy players? And this idea of bifurcating along the lines that you said, or maybe trifurcating, who generates, who transmits, and who ultimately delivers is something that requires focus, because that last mile of the commons has to be taken care of. And that is the likely, probable role of the privileged actors whose balance sheets we have embellished to arrive at this point. And we need a strategy to focus them there so that we can onboard the generation and efficiency devices and the other things in a more competitive way.
Well, let me just put it in a nutshell for us, what we see happening here in California. If, in fact, decarbonizing transportation is important, then do we allow the electric industry to actually lease you an electric vehicle along with your interconnection and with the fuel? Does that bring the cost of mass transit down? Do we actually extend that to actually fueling bulk transit, bus rapid transit, or munis like downtown San Francisco or light rail in LA, where part of your fare actually becomes part of that?
I'd say as long as you don't exclude others to compete with it, kind of why not?
Okay,
You know?
so how many people do you allow have tracks down the middle of the street in San Francisco? They had that problem. They forced a monopoly.
It's a famous Supreme Court case, actually,
Yeah.
that goes to all the issues we're discussing today. When do you let a utility go bankrupt?
Yeah.
I'd just like to close with one final question. I think you've all expressed a diversity of views, shall we say, on the panel. I want to ask you a Stanford-centric question, because I think this is an important one for many of the folks in the room. You have identified a very different vision of the future. All of you are consistent in expressing that idea. And all of you are also consistent in expressing a significant degree of uncertainty that the future is going to be very different. We're not exactly sure what it's going to look like. We're not exactly sure what the transition path is likely to be.
I think we differ more on the transition.
What are the research needs here? How can a research institution like Stanford help in assisting you to answer those questions?
Train more engineers. We don't need more research. We need more engineers.
One answer.
Yeah,
We're doing that, by the way.
More.
Yeah, I'm always been sort of research, development, deployment. So I think you do need more research. I think on all the kinds of things, like the deep discovery science, the moonshots, the things that help inform the nanomaterials for a fault current limiter to override faults and reactive power as we put more devices on. The way to integrate that with policy and the way that Arun is doing sort of uniquely here to be able to say, if this is a disaggregated grid of the future, how do we manage it most intelligently, where technology meets policy, meets market players? There's an unbelievably integrative role, and Dan on the finance side, you'll hear later today, on the integrative role. I'm very proud, Sally and Arun inviting me to do the Energy Technology Collaborative, where the students help push over the line community choice power for East Palo Alto and many of the communities along the peninsula, availing statutes that are recent in California law, but are enabling new model schemes for new communities to begin to have unprecedented authority on their own energy future. So this university has unbelievable capacities to on each place of that, the science, the research, the development, and the deployment, and we're seeing it with community relations right next door, and we're seeing it upstream with unbelievable material science and other research, but most of all, we're seeing it in a collaborative, integrative way. You know, I'm coming from the East Coast, collaborative, compromise, these are dirty words. You know, but here at Stanford, it is the marquee of synthesizing all of these different talents, and that's why I think you're seeing so much of this deployed here first.
Reed, do you have a perspective on that?
So I grew up on the East Coast. When I was 20 years old, my girlfriend went to Stanford and she never came back. So, so I kind of bear a grudge. So there's two things you could do. You could give me the alumni book, and the second thing you could do, is really the same thing that was done with the communications technology revolution. So item by item, thing by thing. Stanford and these environs is the geographic locus of the information age that we know today and can be in energy. And let me just commend in conclusion Steve's opening remarks. I thought they were terrific, and I also thought that the leadership that Stanford has demonstrated by showing how to do it, not just preaching it, is absolutely terrific, absolutely terrific.
All right, well, thank you all very much.
Thank
for the
you.
conversation.